The glass conference room on the 42nd floor of Hartwell and Keene Legal Associates smelled like fresh ink, stale ambition, and the quiet terror of people who had sold their souls for a corner office. Elena Voss sat at the far end of the polished mahogany table, her notary stamp aligned perfectly with the edge of her leather-bound journal, her pen uncapped and ready, her posture straight, despite the ache in her lower back from the chair that was never designed for a woman with hips like hers. She had been working at the firm for 4 years, 3 months, and 11 days, and in all that time, not a single senior partner had ever looked at her without a flicker of irritation, as if her very presence in the room was a clerical error they were too busy to correct. Her boss, Marcus Hartwell, a man whose jawline had been sharpened by decades of casual cruelty, stood at the head of the table, with his hands pressed flat against the wood, his silk tie the color of dried blood, his smile stretched thin over teeth that had bitten through 100 careers. He was speaking to the client in the tone he reserved for people who could have him killed, a tone that was half deference and half desperate performance, and Elena watched him with the detached attention of a woman who had learned long ago that invisibility was its own kind of safety. The client was Dante Calvetti, and even if Elena had not known his name, she would have recognized the silence that entered every room before he did, the way the air pressure shifted, the way the junior associates stopped breathing, the way the security guards stationed by the elevator straightened their spines, as if a drill sergeant had screamed in their ears. He was tall without being lanky, broad without being heavy, and he moved through the law office like a man who owned the building and everyone in it, his charcoal suit cut with the precision of a blade, his dark hair swept back from a face that was too controlled to be handsome and too intense to be ignored. His eyes, the color of winter ocean water, swept the room once and landed on nothing, no one, until they paused, for half a heartbeat, on Elena. She felt the weight of that glance like a hand pressed between her shoulder blades, and then it was gone, and she told herself it was nothing, because men like Dante Calvetti did not notice women like her, women with soft stomachs and thick thighs, and faces that were pleasant, but not pretty. Women who carried their bodies like apologies. Women who had been told, in 1,000 small ways, that they took up too much space. Marcus gestured toward the leather chair at the center of the table, and Dante sat without acknowledging the gesture, his presence settling over the room like a storm cloud pausing before the first crack of thunder. Beside him, a man Elena recognized from the firm's client files as Nico Calvetti, Dante's younger brother, slid into the adjacent chair with the loose-limbed confidence of someone who had never been told no, his smile quick and sharp, his suit slightly too flashy, his cologne too strong. He was the kind of handsome that photographs well and ages poorly, and Elena had learned to read men like him the way other women read fashion magazines, cataloging the tells, the micro-expressions, the tiny cracks in the performance. Nico's left hand tapped against his thigh, a nervous rhythm that did not match his easy smile, and Elena filed that detail away in the same mental cabinet where she kept every signature she had ever witnessed, every date she had ever verified, every margin error she had ever caught before it became a lawsuit. She was good at her job, not because she loved the law, but because she had learned, as a child in a house full of shouting, that the only way to survive was to notice everything and say nothing. Her grandmother, a retired legal secretary who had worked for the same firm for 42 years before a stroke, stole her words but not her wisdom, had taught her that a notary stamp was not a rubber tool, it was a weapon, and that a single careless impression could destroy a life, a family, a fortune. Elena had never forgotten that lesson, and she carried it with her into every document review, every signing, every moment when a powerful man waved his hand and expected her to look the other way. Today, the document on the table was a property transfer agreement, a thick stack of cream-colored pages bound with a brass clip, the kind of document that moved millions of dollars and hundreds of lives without a single headline. Marcus had been rushing the deal for weeks, his voice growing sharper with every delay, his patience thinning like hair on a middle-aged scalp. And now, with Dante Calvetti in the room, he was practically vibrating with the need to close. He snapped his fingers at Elena, a gesture he had used 100 times before, a gesture that reduced her from a licensed notary with a decade of experience to a servant, a piece of office equipment, a thing to be summoned. Elena rose from her chair, her navy blazer pulling slightly across her shoulders, her skirt whispering against her stockings, and she walked to the head of the table with her stamp in one hand and her journal in the other, her heels clicking a steady rhythm on the marble floor. She did not hurry, because hurrying implied fear, and she had promised herself, on the morning of her 30th birthday, that she would never let Marcus Hartwell see her afraid again. He had called her into his office that day, not to wish her well, but to tell her that the firm was considering a new dress code, something more professional, something that would present a sharper image to clients. And he had looked at her body with the clinical disgust of a man examining a stain on his carpet. She had stood there, her face burning, her hands clenched at her sides, and she had said nothing, because saying something would have cost her the job, and the job was the only thing standing between her and the kind of poverty that left bruises. Now, she reached the table and set her journal down beside the contract, her movements deliberate, her expression neutral, her heart beating a slow, steady drumbeat of dread. Marcus thrust a pen toward her, his fingers trembling slightly with impatience, and said, in a voice that carried to every corner of the room, "Finally, Elena, we don't have all day. The notary section is on page 47. Just stamp it and let us finish." The junior associates, two thin young men in identical navy suits, exchanged a glance that was half smirk and half relief, grateful that the target of Marcus's contempt was someone else. Nico Calvetti leaned back in his chair and let out a short laugh, the sound sharp and dismissive, and said, "What's the matter, Marcus? Your staff can't keep up. Maybe you need someone a little more efficient." The words landed on Elena like a slap, and she felt the familiar heat rise up her neck, the flush that she could never control, the physical betrayal of her body that made her humiliation visible to everyone. She kept her eyes on the document, her fingers steady as she flipped through the pages, scanning each one with the practiced speed of someone who had reviewed thousands of contracts, her mind cataloging the signatures, the dates, the notary blocks, the witness lines. Page 47, the notary certificate, was perfectly formatted, the language precise, the blanks waiting for her stamp and signature. But something was wrong. Elena felt the wrongness before she identified it. A prickle at the base of her skull, a whisper from the part of her brain that never stopped noticing. She looked at the witness signature on page 46, a looping, ornate scrawl that was supposed to belong to a man named Anthony Rizzo, a longtime associate of the Calvetti family, a name she had seen on a dozen other documents in the firm's archives. She had a memory for signatures, a strange, almost photographic recall that had made her the subject of quiet mockery in the office. The weird girl who remembered handwriting, the fat notary who cared too much about ink. But she knew, with a certainty that settled into her bones like cold water, that the signature on this document was not Anthony Rizzo's. She had seen Rizzo's signature 3 months earlier, on a property lien filed in the same county, and it had been a tight, angular scrawl, the letters cramped together like a man who had learned to write in a hurry and never slowed down. This signature was too fluid, too confident, the R too rounded, the Z too flourished. It was a forgery, a good one, but a forgery nonetheless. Elena's hand paused above the page, her stamp hovering in the air, and the silence in the room shifted, sharpened, became a blade pressed against her throat. Marcus leaned forward, his face flushing an ugly red, and said, "Elena, what are you waiting for? Stamp the document." She looked up at him, her brown eyes steady, her voice quiet but clear, and said, "I can't." The word dropped into the room like a stone into still water, and the ripples spread outward, touching every face, every posture, every held breath. Nico stopped tapping his fingers. The junior associates stopped smirking. Dante Calvetti, who had been staring out the window at the Chicago skyline, turned his head slowly, his gaze settling on Elena with a new, sharp focus, as if he was seeing her for the first time. Marcus's voice rose, cracking with disbelief and fury, and he said, "What do you mean you can't? This is a notary certificate. Your only job is to stamp it. Do you think you're a lawyer now? Do you think you have the authority to delay $1 million deal because you're feeling difficult?" The word difficult hung in the air, and Elena felt it land on her like a brand, a label she had been given 1,000 times before, by teachers who thought she asked too many questions, by bosses who thought she cared too much about details, by men who thought a woman her size should be grateful for any attention and silent about everything else. She did not flinch. She did not look away. She said, her voice still quiet, still steady, "The witness signature on page 46 is not Anthony Rizzo's. I've seen his signature before, and this is a forgery." The room exploded. Nico shot to his feet, his chair scraping against the marble floor with a sound like a scream, his face twisting into a mask of outrage that was just slightly too theatrical, just slightly too rehearsed. He shouted, "This is ridiculous. Are you accusing me of something? I was there when Rizzo signed. I watched him put the pen to the paper. This woman is wasting our time." Marcus was shouting too, his words tumbling over Nico's, a cascade of threats and insults and demands that Elena be removed from the room, that she be fired, that she be reported to the State Notary Commission for incompetence and obstruction. The junior associates were frozen, their eyes wide, their mouths slightly open, spectators to a disaster they did not understand. And through all of it, Dante Calvetti did not move. He sat in his chair, his hands resting on the armrests, his expression unreadable, his gaze fixed on Elena with an intensity that made her skin prickle, that made her feel, for the first time in years, truly seen. She did not know if that was a good thing or a death sentence. She only knew that she could not look away from him, and that the chaos swirling around her felt distant, muffled, like a storm heard through thick glass. Marcus grabbed her arm, his fingers digging into the soft flesh above her elbow, his face inches from hers, his breath sour with coffee and panic, and he hissed, "You stupid fat cow. You're going to ruin everything. Stamp the document now, or I will make sure you never work in this city again." The words hit her like a physical blow, and she felt the old wound tear open, the wound that had been carved into her by a lifetime of people who looked at her body and saw only failure, only excess, only a reason to dismiss her. She felt tears prick at the corners of her eyes, but she did not let them fall. She did not pull her arm away. She looked past Marcus, past his red face and his bulging eyes, and she met Dante Calvetti's gaze, and she said, her voice trembling but clear, "I will not stamp a forged document. I don't care what it costs me." The silence that followed was absolute. It was the kind of silence that swallowed sound, that erased breath, that made the hum of the air conditioning feel like a roar. And then Dante Calvetti stood up. He did not stand quickly. He did not shout. He rose from his chair, with the deliberate, unhurried grace of a predator who knew that his prey had nowhere to run, and he walked around the table, his shoes silent on the marble, his presence filling the room like smoke. He stopped beside Elena, close enough that she could smell his cologne, something dark and expensive, something that reminded her of cedar and cold nights and dangerous places. He looked at Marcus's hand, still gripping her arm, and he said, in a voice that was soft and lethal, "Let go of her." Marcus's fingers opened instantly, as if burned, and he stumbled back a step, his face draining of color, his mouth opening and closing like a fish pulled onto a dock. Dante did not look at him again. He turned to Elena, his eyes tracing her face, her flushed cheeks, her trembling jaw, the tears she was refusing to shed, and he said, "Show me." She blinked, her mind struggling to catch up with the shift in the room, the sudden reversal of power, the impossible reality that Dante Calvetti was standing beside her, asking her to explain. She swallowed hard, her throat dry, and she pointed to the witness signature on page 46, her finger steady, despite the shaking in her hands. She said, "This signature is supposed to be Anthony Rizzo's, but I reviewed a lien document he signed 3 months ago, and his handwriting is completely different. The pressure is wrong, the letter formation is wrong. Someone else signed his name." Nico lunged forward, his face contorted with fury, and he shouted, "She's lying. She's trying to sabotage the deal. Dante, you can't believe this nobody over your own brother." Dante raised one hand, a single casual gesture, and Nico stopped as if he had hit a wall, his mouth snapping shut, his eyes wild with a fear that Elena recognized, the fear of a man who had been caught. Dante looked at the signature, then at Elena, then at his brother, and the silence stretched, thin and brittle, until he said, "Anthony Rizzo has been dead for 2 weeks. His body was found in the river yesterday, so whoever signed this document today is either a ghost or a liar." The words landed like a bomb, and the room shattered. Nico's face went white, then gray, then a sickly shade of green, and he backed away from the table, his hands raised as if to ward off a blow. Marcus collapsed into a chair, his legs giving out beneath him, his expression one of dawning, horrified comprehension. The junior associates fled, their footsteps echoing down the hallway, their careers already crumbling behind them, and Elena stood in the center of the chaos, her stamp still in her hand, her heart pounding so hard she could feel it in her teeth, and she realized that she had just saved a Mafia boss from a trap that his own brother had set, and that nothing in her life would ever be the same. Dante turned to her, his expression still unreadable, but his eyes held something new, something that looked almost like respect, and he said, "What's your name?" She told him. He nodded, once, and said, "Elena Voss, you're the only honest person in this building, and that makes you the most dangerous woman in Chicago." He reached into his jacket and pulled out a card, black with silver lettering. No name, just a phone number, and he pressed it into her palm, his fingers brushing against her skin, his touch cool and deliberate. He said, "Call this number tomorrow. We need to talk about your future." Then he turned and walked out of the conference room, his security team materializing from the shadows to flank him, and the last thing Elena saw before the door swung shut was the back of his head, the set of his shoulders, the absolute certainty of a man who had just decided that she belonged to him. She stood there for a long moment, the card clutched in her hand, the stamp heavy in the other, the wreckage of her old life scattered around her like broken glass. Marcus was weeping quietly into his hands. Nico was being escorted out by 2 men in dark suits, his protests fading into the elevator's hum. And Elena, the curvy notary assistant who had been called difficult, useless, and a fat cow, had just become the most valuable person in the underworld. She did not know whether to laugh or cry or run, so she did none of those things. She walked back to her desk, packed her personal items into a cardboard box, and left the building through the service entrance, the cold Chicago wind biting at her cheeks, the city lights blurring through the tears she finally allowed to fall. She went home to her small apartment in Logan Square, the one with the leaky faucet and the radiator that clanked all night, and she sat on her bed, the card on her nightstand, the stamp in her drawer, and she thought about her grandmother, about the lesson she had taught her, about the power of a single impression. She had used her stamp to stop a crime, and now a crime lord wanted to thank her, and she had no idea what that gratitude would cost. She did not sleep that night. She watched the shadows move across her ceiling and listened to the city breathe, and when the sun rose, pale and cold over the rooftops, she picked up the card and dialed the number. The voice that answered was not Dante's. It was a woman's, crisp and professional, and it said, "Miss Voss, a car will be at your address in 1 hour. Please be ready." The line went dead before Elena could respond, and she stood in her tiny kitchen, her phone pressed to her ear, her heart hammering, and she realized that she had just stepped onto a path that led straight into the heart of the Calvetti empire, and there was no turning back. She showered, dressed in her best navy suit, the one that fit her curves without apology, and she waited by the window, watching the street below. The car that arrived was black, sleek, and expensive, the kind of car that whispered power instead of screaming it. And the driver, a stoic man with a shaved head and a neck like a tree trunk, opened the door for her without a word. She climbed inside, the leather seats cool against her skin, and the car pulled away from the curb, carrying her through the morning traffic, past the skyscrapers and the river, and the neighborhoods she had known her whole life, toward a destination she could not guess. They drove for 40 minutes, leaving the city behind, until the buildings gave way to trees, and the roads narrowed, and the gates appeared, tall iron gates, with cameras and guards, and the quiet, unmistakable presence of lethal security. The car stopped in front of a mansion that was less a house and more a fortress, a sprawling stone structure, with ivy climbing the walls and windows that reflected the gray sky like mirrors. The driver opened her door, and she stepped out onto a gravel driveway, her heels sinking slightly, her breath misting in the cold air. A woman in a tailored black dress met her at the door, her smile polite, but her eyes assessing, and she said, "Miss Voss, Mr. Calvetti is waiting for you in the library. Please follow me." Elena followed, her footsteps echoing on the marble floors, her eyes taking in the chandeliers, the paintings, the heavy velvet drapes, the sense of old money and older violence that clung to every surface. The library was a vast room, with floor-to-ceiling bookshelves, a fireplace crackling with flames, and a massive oak desk that looked like it had been carved from a single tree. Dante Calvetti stood by the window, his back to her, his silhouette sharp against the gray light, and when he turned, she felt the same jolt she had felt in the conference room, the same electric awareness, the same terrifying pull. He gestured to a leather chair in front of the desk, and she sat, her hands folded in her lap, her spine straight, her fear tucked away behind a mask of calm. He sat across from her, his eyes never leaving her face, and he said, "You saved my name yesterday, my reputation, and possibly my life. My brother was trying to transfer a property that didn't belong to him, using a dead man's signature, and if that contract had been stamped, I would have been implicated in a fraud that could have brought down my entire organization." He paused, his gaze intensifying, and he continued, "I don't believe in debts. I believe in investments, and I want to invest in you." Elena's breath caught in her throat, and she said, her voice steadier than she felt, "What kind of investment?" He leaned back in his chair, his fingers steepled, his expression unreadable, and he said, "I need someone with your skills, your memory, your integrity, someone who can review documents, spot forgeries, protect my interests from the inside. I have lawyers, accountants, advisors, but none of them have what you have. The courage to say no when everyone else is saying yes. He paused again, letting the silence stretch, and then he said, I'm offering you a position, a very well-paid position, as my personal document analyst. You'll work directly for me. You'll have security, housing, and anything else you need. But you'll also have a target on your back, because the people who tried to destroy me yesterday will try again, and they'll know that you're the one who stopped them. Elena felt the weight of his words settle over her. The danger, the opportunity, the impossible choice between safety and significance. She thought about her apartment, her leaky faucet, her empty fridge, her career that had been destroyed by a man who called her a fat cow. She thought about her grandmother, who had told her that a stamp could destroy a life, but who had also told her that a woman with integrity was the most powerful force in the world. She looked at Dante Calvetti, at his cold eyes and his controlled face, and the faint, almost invisible tension in his jaw, and she realized that he was not just offering her a job, he was offering her a chance to matter, to be seen, to use her gift for something more than rubber stamping other people's lies. She said, her voice quiet but firm, I'll take the job, on one condition. His eyebrow rose, a flicker of surprise, and he said, Name it. She said, I'm not going to be your puppet. I'll review your documents. I'll protect your interests, but I won't break the law, and I won't look the other way when something is wrong. If that's not acceptable, then I'll walk out of here right now, and you'll never see me again. The silence that followed was heavy, charged, and then Dante Calvetti did something she had not expected. He smiled. It was a small smile, a private smile, a smile that transformed his face from dangerous to devastating. And he said, Elena Voss, that's exactly why I want you. He stood, extended his hand across the desk, and she took it, his grip warm and firm and electric, and she felt the deal seal between them, a contract written in trust and danger, and the strange, terrifying possibility of something more. The weeks that followed were a blur of luxury and paranoia, of learning the inner workings of the Calvetti empire, of reviewing documents in a private office, with windows that overlooked the estate's gardens, of being driven to meetings in armored cars, of eating meals prepared by a personal chef, of sleeping in a suite that was larger than her entire apartment. She was given a wardrobe of custom-tailored clothes, blazers and dresses, and silk blouses that fit her curves perfectly, that made her feel powerful instead of ashamed, that made her stand in front of the mirror and see, for the first time in years, a woman who was beautiful. Dante was a constant presence, not hovering, but always nearby, his attention a weight she could feel, even when he was in another room. He asked her opinion on contracts, on business proposals, on the subtle language of legal documents that could hide traps and loopholes, and he listened to her answers with a focus that made her feel valued, essential, irreplaceable. He never mentioned her body, not directly, but she caught him looking at her sometimes, his gaze lingering on the curve of her hip, the softness of her waist, the fullness of her figure, and there was nothing dismissive in his eyes, only a heat that made her stomach tighten and her pulse quicken. She told herself it was nothing, that men like him did not desire women like her, that it was gratitude or curiosity or some other emotion that she was misreading. But then, one evening he invited her to dinner in the mansion's formal dining room, a vast space with a chandelier that dripped crystals and a table that could seat 30, and he sat at the head, and she sat at his right hand, and the candlelight flickered across his face as he said, "You've been here for a month, and you haven't asked me for anything. No money, no favors, No protection for your family. Why? She set down her fork, her appetite fading, and she said, "Because I don't want to owe you anything I can't repay." He leaned forward, his eyes dark and intense, and he said, "You already owe me nothing. You saved me. Remember, I'm the one in your debt." She shook her head, a small, sad smile on her lips, and she said, "You don't understand. I've spent my whole life being invisible, being dismissed, being told I was too much and not enough at the same time. And now, I'm here, in this mansion, wearing clothes that cost more than my old rent, and I keep waiting for the other shoe to drop, for someone to laugh and tell me it was all a joke, that I don't belong here." Her voice cracked on the last word, and she looked down at her plate, her cheeks burning with a shame she could not control. Dante was silent for a long moment, and then he stood, walked around the table, and knelt beside her chair, a gesture so unexpected, so uncharacteristic, that she forgot to breathe. He took her hand, his fingers gentle, his touch warm, and he said, "Elena, look at me." She raised her eyes, her vision blurry with unshed tears, and she met his gaze, and what she saw there was not pity, not condescension, but a fierce, protective intensity that made her heart stutter. He said, "You are not invisible, you are not too much, and you are not a joke. You are the most remarkable woman I have ever met, and anyone who made you feel otherwise is a fool who doesn't deserve to breathe the same air as you." He paused, his thumb tracing circles on the back of her hand, and he continued, "I don't say things I don't mean, and I don't keep people close unless they matter. And you, Elena Voss, matter more than anyone has mattered to me in a very long time." The tears spilled over then, sliding down her cheeks, and she did not try to hide them, because for the first time in her life, she felt seen, truly seen, by a man who could have anyone and had chosen her. She did not know what to say, so she said nothing, and he did not push. He simply stayed there, kneeling beside her, holding her hand, until the tears stopped, and the silence became something comfortable, something shared. The next morning, everything changed. She was in her office, reviewing a shipping manifest that had been flagged by one of Dante's accountants, when her phone buzzed with an alert from the estate's security system. The screen showed a live feed from the front gate, and her blood ran cold when she saw the face of the man standing there, arguing with the guards. It was Marcus Hartwell, her former boss, his face haggard, his suit rumpled, his eyes wild with desperation. She watched as he was denied entry, as he shouted and waved his arms, as the guards remained impassive, and then she made a decision that surprised even herself. She called the gate and told them to let him in. She met him in the mansion's grand foyer, her arms crossed, her expression cold, and she said, "What do you want, Marcus?" He stumbled toward her, his hands outstretched, his voice cracking as he said, "Elena, please, you have to help me. Nico Calvetti is threatening to kill me. He says I'm a loose end. He says I know too much about the forgery. You have to talk to Dante. You have to get me protection." She looked at him, this man who had belittled her for years, who had called her a fat cow, who had grabbed her arm and tried to force her to commit a crime, and she felt nothing but a cold, distant pity. She said, "Why should I help you? You tried to ruin me. You tried to make me complicit in fraud. You never once treated me like a human being." He fell to his knees, actually fell to his knees on the marble floor, his pride shattered, his dignity gone, and he sobbed, "Because I'm begging you, because I was wrong, because I'm a coward and a bully, and I don't deserve your help, but I'm going to die if you don't give it." She stared at him for a long moment, and then she heard footsteps behind her, the familiar, measured tread of Dante Calvetti. He stopped beside her, his presence a wall of heat and danger, and he looked at the weeping man on the floor with the detached curiosity of a scientist examining a specimen. He said, "Who is this?" Elena said, "My former boss. He says Nico is threatening to kill him." Dante's expression did not change, but something flickered in his eyes, something cold and calculating, and he said, "Nico has been making threats. That's interesting, because Nico has been missing for 3 weeks, ever since he fled the city after the forgery was exposed." He turned to Elena, his gaze softening slightly, and he said, "What do you want to do with him?" She looked at Marcus, at his tear-streaked face and his trembling hands, and she made a choice. She said, "Give him protection, not because he deserves it, but because he's a witness, and because I'm not going to let Nico Calvetti turn me into the kind of person who lets people die." Dante nodded, a single, approving dip of his chin, and he gestured to one of his security men, who stepped forward and hauled Marcus to his feet, dragging him away toward a waiting car. Then, Dante turned to Elena, his eyes searching her face, and he said, "You continue to surprise me." She shrugged, a small, self-conscious gesture, and she said, "I'm just trying to do the right thing." He stepped closer, his voice dropping to a murmur, and he said, "The right thing is the hardest thing, and most people never do it. But you do it instinctively, and that's why I need you, not just for your skills, but for your soul." The word soul hung in the air between them, heavy and intimate, and Elena felt her heart lurch, felt the ground shift beneath her feet, felt the dangerous, exhilarating pull of a man who was offering her not just protection, but something deeper, something that terrified her more than any threat. She stepped back, breaking the spell, and she said, her voice slightly unsteady, "I should get back to work." He let her go, but his gaze followed her down the hallway, and she could feel it like a physical touch, a promise, a warning, a declaration. The counterattack came 3 days later. Elena was in the city, accompanied by 2 bodyguards, visiting a notary supply store to replace her old stamp, which had been damaged during the chaos of her departure from Hartwell and Keene. She was standing at the counter, examining a new stamp, when the front window exploded inward, a shower of glass and noise and screaming, and she was thrown to the floor, her ears ringing, her vision swimming. The bodyguards were shouting, their guns drawn, and she heard the screech of tires outside, the roar of an engine, the rapid fade of a vehicle speeding away. She pushed herself up, her hands bleeding from tiny cuts, her heart pounding, and she saw the brick lying on the floor beside her, a note tied to it, with a piece of red string. She untied the note with trembling fingers, and she read the words scrawled in black ink. "You should have stamped the contract. Now you'll pay." The handwriting was Nico's. She recognized the looping, ornate scrawl from the forged signature, and she felt a cold, hard knot of fear settle in her stomach. The bodyguards rushed her back to the estate, and Dante met her at the door, his face a mask of controlled fury, his hands gentle as he examined her cuts, his voice a low, dangerous growl as he said, "Who did this?" She handed him the note, and he read it, and the temperature in the room dropped 10 degrees. He crumpled the paper in his fist, his knuckles white, and he said, "My brother has made a fatal mistake." He turned to his security chief, a grizzled man named Victor, and he issued a series of quiet, lethal orders. Orders that sent teams of men into the city, that activated surveillance networks, that put a price on Nico's head, that would make every criminal in Chicago turn against him. Then he took Elena's hand and led her to the library, where he sat her down in a leather chair and poured her a glass of brandy, his movements careful, his expression softening as he said, "I'm sorry. I should have protected you better. I underestimated how desperate Nico had become. She took a sip of the brandy, the liquid burning a path down her throat, and she said, "It's not your fault. I knew the risks when I took this job." He knelt in front of her, just as he had done at the dinner table, and he took her hands, his thumbs brushing over the bandages that covered her cuts, and he said, "It is my fault, because I brought you into this world, and I promised to keep you safe, and I failed." She looked at him, at the guilt in his eyes, at the tension in his jaw, at the way his hands trembled slightly against hers, and she realized that this man, this ruthless, dangerous, powerful man, was afraid for her. The realization broke something open inside her, a wall she had built around her heart, a wall made of years of rejection and shame, and the belief that she was unworthy of being loved. She reached up and touched his face, her fingers tracing the line of his cheekbone, and she said, "You didn't fail. I'm still here. I'm still alive, and I'm not going anywhere." He closed his eyes, leaning into her touch, and for a moment, he was not a mafia boss, not a crime lord, not a man who controlled half the city. He was just a man, vulnerable and grateful, and desperately, impossibly in love. He opened his eyes, and the heat in them made her breath catch, and he said, "Elena, I need to tell you something." She waited, her heart hammering, her hand still on his face. He said, "I've spent my whole life surrounded by people who wanted something from me. Money, power, protection, revenge. But you've never asked me for anything. You've only given. Your honesty, your courage, your integrity. And somewhere along the way, I stopped seeing you as an employee and started seeing you as something else, something I never thought I'd find." He paused, his voice dropping to a whisper, and he said, "I'm in love with you, Elena Voss, and I know I have no right to ask for your heart, but I'm asking anyway." The words hung in the air, and Elena felt the world tilt, felt the axis of her life shift, felt the impossible, terrifying, wonderful truth of what he was saying. She had known, on some level, that her feelings for him had grown beyond professional respect, beyond gratitude, beyond the strange, electric attraction that sparked between them whenever they were in the same room. She had tried to ignore it, to dismiss it, to tell herself that it was a fantasy, that a man like Dante Calvetti could never love a woman like her. But here he was, on his knees, telling her that he did. She leaned forward, her forehead resting against his, her eyes closed, her voice a broken whisper as she said, "I love you too. I've been trying not to, but I do." He kissed her then, a soft, gentle kiss that was nothing like the fierce, possessive man she knew. A kiss that was a question, and a promise, and a prayer, all at once. She kissed him back, her hands sliding into his hair, her heart soaring, her fears melting away like frost in the sun. When they finally pulled apart, he was smiling, a real smile, a smile that reached his eyes and transformed his face into something almost boyish. And he said, "We're going to find my brother, and we're going to end this. And then I'm going to spend the rest of my life making sure you never feel invisible again." The hunt for Nico took 2 weeks. Dante's network, vast and ruthless, tracked him to a warehouse on the south side, a crumbling building near the docks, where he had been hiding with a handful of loyal men, plotting his next move. Elena insisted on going with Dante, despite his protests, despite his fear for her safety, and she stood beside him in the cold, damp darkness of the warehouse, her heart pounding, her hands steady, as they confronted the man who had tried to destroy them both. Nico was cornered, his face haggard, his eyes wild, a gun clutched in his trembling hand. He laughed, a bitter, desperate sound, and he said, "So the fat notary and my traitor brother have come to finish me off. How romantic." Dante stepped forward, his body a shield between Elena and the gun, his voice cold and calm as he said, "Put the gun down, Nico. It's over." Nico shook his head, his finger tightening on the trigger, and he said, "It's not over. I was supposed to inherit everything, the property, the power, the respect. But you took it all, and then you brought this woman in to humiliate me, to expose me, to ruin me." Elena stepped out from behind Dante, ignoring his sharp intake of breath, ignoring the danger, and she looked at Nico with a calm that surprised even herself. She said, "You ruined yourself, Nico. You forged a dead man's signature. You tried to frame your own brother, and you did it because you were greedy and lazy, and you thought no one would notice. But I noticed, and that's not my fault. That's yours." Nico's face twisted with rage, and he raised the gun, pointing it directly at her, and time seemed to slow, to stretch, to become a thin, fragile thread that could snap at any moment. Dante moved, faster than she had ever seen a man move, and he knocked the gun aside, just as Nico pulled the trigger, the shot going wide, the bullet burying itself in the warehouse wall with a dull thud. Dante's men swarmed forward, disarming Nico, pinning him to the ground, and the crisis was over, the threat neutralized, the brother defeated. Elena stood in the center of the chaos, her breath coming in ragged gasps, her body trembling with the aftershock of adrenaline, and Dante turned to her, his face pale, his eyes blazing with a fear and a fury, and a love that took her breath away. He pulled her into his arms, his grip almost crushing, and he said, his voice rough with emotion, "Don't ever do that again. Don't ever put yourself in danger like that. I can't lose you. I won't lose you." She buried her face in his chest, her tears soaking into his shirt, and she said, "I'm sorry. I had to face him. I had to prove to myself that I wasn't afraid anymore." He held her tighter, his lips pressing against her hair, and he said, "You're the bravest person I've ever known, and I love you, and I'm never letting you go." The aftermath was a blur of police statements and legal maneuvers, and the quiet, efficient cleanup that followed every Calvetti family crisis. Nico was handed over to the authorities, his crimes documented, his future a long, dark stretch of prison cells and regret. Marcus Hartwell, protected by Dante's security, testified against him, his cowardice finally serving a useful purpose. And Elena, the curvy notary assistant who had refused to stamp a contract, became a legend in the underworld, a symbol of integrity in a world built on lies. She stayed with Dante, not as an employee, but as a partner, an equal, a woman who had earned her place at his side through courage and intelligence, and an unshakable moral compass. They were married, in a private ceremony on the estate, the garden filled with flowers and candlelight, and the quiet, joyful tears of the few people they trusted. She wore a dress of ivory silk, custom-tailored, to celebrate every curve, every softness, every inch of the body she had finally learned to love. Dante looked at her as she walked down the aisle, and his eyes were wet, and his smile was wide, and he whispered, when she reached him, "You're the most beautiful thing I've ever seen." She laughed, a sound of pure, unguarded happiness, and she said, "You're not so bad yourself." They exchanged vows, simple and sincere, promises of love and loyalty and protection, and when they kissed, the small crowd erupted in applause, and Elena felt, for the first time in her life, completely, utterly, unconditionally loved. The years that followed were not without danger. The Calvetti Empire was a fortress, but fortresses attracted enemies, and there were moments of fear, of crisis, of narrow escapes and tense negotiations. But through it all, Elena remained at Dante's side, her stamp always ready, her eyes always sharp, her integrity never wavering. She became known as the Notary Queen, a title she found both ridiculous and strangely flattering, and her reputation for spotting forgeries and protecting the family's interests became legendary. She and Dante built a life together, a life of luxury and danger and deep, abiding love, and every night, when they lay in their bed, the city lights glittering beyond the windows, he would pull her close and whisper, "You saved me, Elena. You saved my name, my empire, my soul." And she would smile, her hand resting over his heart, and she would say, "You saved me too. You saw me when no one else did, and you loved me when I didn't know how to love myself." The story of the curvy notary assistant who refused to stamp a contract became a story told and retold, a story of courage and integrity and the power of a single, quiet no. And Elena Voss Calvetti, the woman at the center of that story, lived the rest of her days knowing that she had mattered, that she had made a difference, that she had been seen. The end.